grown children and 5 grandchildren. I know I don't look like that.
Right.
But when your child calls you and start talking about the conversation of being grateful, of being thankful, you know, that's when you want to spend some time. So my conversation with her got away, and she had some amazing things to say, so I got caught up into it, you know. So, but thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I want to start with just a short opening because this has been a very interesting time, our election this year, I think for all of us, no matter where you sit and where you stand. So we, of course, want to welcome you all to this discussion, this critical discussion. I love the idea of election autopsy, as we gather here to find ourselves at a pivotal moment in our democratic journey, where understanding the nuances of our electoral processes have never been more essential. Elections are not just events, they are reflections of our values, our priorities, and our collective will. However, they can also reveal discrepancies, challenges, and opportunities for us to grow. And I think that's where we are right now, and I think that's the most exciting thing that we can focus on, is how do we grow from this, and how do we become better. Today, we aim to dissect the recent electoral outcomes, examine the factors that shaped them, the narratives that emerged, and the lessons we can glean for the future. Of course, our expert panel will discuss various dimensions from voter behavior and turnout trends to the impact of misinformation and the role of new technologies in shaping electoral landscapes. By engaging this vital conversation, we hope to foster a deeper understanding of our electoral systems and inspire actionable insights that can strengthen our democracy. So let's spark on this conversation together. Amir, as always, I think we just come out of a recent conversation with you, and of course, Millsaps, I love that school. Amazing. And so let's get right into some of the most important things that we need to talk about. What were the key trends in voter turnout in both the presidential and state elections in Mississippi? Were there notable increases or declines in participation compared to previous elections?
Yeah, so my sense of turnout nationwide is that it was a little lower than it was in 2020, but not by much. I was shocked to see, however, that turnout in Mississippi was down 12.5% compared to 2020. It was actually, we're talking about a time in history where turnout was either flat compared to 2020 or a little bit higher in many states and markedly higher in some of the swing states. But Mississippi was second to last in terms of the, I guess, decline in voter turnout compared to 2020. It was second only to Alaska, which I think had a 15 percentage point drop. So 12.5% fewer eligible voters turned out in the election in Mississippi than did in 2020. And I suppose if one of the goals of any group is to mobilize voter turnout in Mississippi specifically, that should be a pretty sobering number. I'm sure that we'll get into particular demographic trends in terms of, who voted and who they voted for, but that 12.5% dip in Mississippi is something that really caught my eye as I was kind of going over the turnout stats in preparation for this panel.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that I would add to that is, overall, as Dr. Schmidt mentioned, turnout seemed to dip a little bit since 2020 or stay about the same. I think it's also important to note that turnout in this election cycle was the second highest that we've seen in decades after 2020, and so turnout overall is actually on an upward trend in terms of kind of the overall electoral scheme in the U.S. And there were certain pockets where we actually saw pretty significant increases in turnout in certain states, not in Mississippi, but in states like Alabama and Louisiana, where there were actually newly created congressional districts that were the result of lawsuits filed under the Voting Rights Act, challenging the maps that those states created because they diluted black votes in those states. The courts required that there were new congressional districts drawn in those states that gave black voters an opportunity to actually elect a candidate of their choice for the first time in decades, in Alabama for the first time ever in that area. And so in those areas you saw previously really low turnout, which makes sense because the majority of people in those districts did not have a real meaningful opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice because of how the lines were drawn. After the districts were created, what you saw was a significant bump in turnout, which led to the election of two black candidates, two Shamari Figures and Cleo Fields in Louisiana. And for the first time ever, those voters were able to elect a candidate who they actually wanted to represent them. And I think that is really telling, not only for the story in Alabama and Louisiana, but for the story here in Mississippi, because in Mississippi, what we've seen over the span of so many years is really significant gerrymandering, really significant drawing of the boundaries, both at the congressional level and the state legislative level, that either hacks certain types of voters into certain districts or cracks voters across multiple districts, that leaves voters in those places without a real meaningful opportunity to elect who they want to elect. And I think what we saw with the Alabama and Louisiana stories is when voters understand that their vote actually has some power, that they can actually exercise their political preferences in a meaningful way, that's when they actually turn out to the polls and cast their votes. And so I think that's an interesting story to keep in mind as we think about, I'm sure we'll get to these questions later. What can we do in Mississippi to help boost turnout? I think that's one of the types of structural things that we have to think about.
And I want to touch one before we move to the demographic question. When we talk about this 12% drop in Mississippi, also what we saw in 2024, there were so many initiatives, Road to 60, there were organizations coming together, there was money poured into Mississippi to just focus on get the vote out, and not just in Harris County, all over the state. So for us, I think that's significant to say we still had a 12% drop in voter participation. So talk about that a little bit, because what was driving those factors? We seem to have been talking to people on the ground. We've been talking about the policies and the issues that impact their lives. There were push in communities that probably had not gotten a lot of that, kind of rub. And so why would we still have a 12% drop? What was the factors that focused on that?
Well, one thing that Amir said, which I think is quite profound, is that when people feel dispossessed and marginalized by the political process, they're less likely to turn out. And so the creation of, I think it's 2 majority black districts in Alabama, following the Allen v. Milligan decision, it makes total sense that turnout would be up in those districts when the voters in those districts are empowered to elect a candidate that shares their racial or ethnic background. When people don't feel represented by the political process, they stay home. And I'm thinking in particular about young voters. This is another statistic that should give us pause. So in 2020, 51% of voters 18 to 29 turned out to vote or cast a mail-in ballot. In 2024, it was 42% nationwide. Now, I'm not able to speak to broad turnout statistics for every demographic group because turnout statistics tend to trickle in a little bit slower than who voted for whom and what the gap was, say, between one particular racial group's preference for Harris or Trump. But I do know about young voters because of a really good initiative and work that's being done at Tufts University right now. And pre-election polling showed that voters 18 to 29, on balance, preferred Kamala Harris to Donald Trump by about 17 to 18 percentage points. Among the voters 18 to 29 that turned out, Harris won by 4 percentage points. Now that's the best polling in the country, polling that I have no reason to doubt, that suggested pre-election that if we had 100% voter turnout among 18 to 29-year-olds, you would have had Harris win 18 to 29-year-olds by 17 percentage points. So that means that many of the young voters that stayed home I mean, I'm talking to people who may not like the result of the recent election. Many of the young voters that stayed home, had they been mobilized to vote, we might be looking at a different outcome in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So the feeling of political alienation that people are feeling right now, that matters big time. And if we're talking about an 18 to 29-year-old population that in the aggregate does not feel represented by the political process and is not turning out to vote, is turning out at 42%. And I mean, that's also something that should give us pause, because those 18 to 29-year-olds are the future.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
That polling that was done pre-election,
Yeah.
how close to the election was that done? Was it, do you know?
Yeah, about 3 or 4 months in advance. Harvard University polling, really good
So
polling.
basically, it could have been something going on in the campaigning in the last week of the election, the last month of the election, that may have changed their minds about voting, you think?
Perhaps. It's very rare, though, for something to happen so close to an election that an entire demographic group sort of stays home en masse. Well, I mean, it can certainly happen, but I think it's much more likely that the young voters that supported Harris indeed supported Harris and told public opinion pollsters as much, and then simply did not vote, and probably weren't ever going to vote, which is something that we all need to think about.
And the demographics, Amir, how did demographic factors influence voter turnout in Mississippi in the presidential and state races?
Yeah, well, so, this year was a federal election cycle, and so we had president on the ballot, we had one Senate race, we had all 4 congressional races, and then we had, a smattering of other types of state races, like the state Supreme Court race that's going to a runoff in a few days. It's interesting that there were only, I believe there was only one congressional race where there was actually a competitor to the incumbent. The U.S. Senate race was contested, but the Democratic candidate did not have the types of resources that are really necessary to mount a truly competitive campaign in any state, in particular in Mississippi. And so I think part of this turnout story, and this goes to your previous question, part of the turnout story is that voters didn't really have a choice in many of these races. And so if you don't have a choice, if there's only one candidate running in your district, why would you think it's important to go and vote, right? And so part of the story here is that we need to provide choices to our voters and meaningful choices to our voters to actually compel them to go vote. I think the other thing that is really important, and this goes to some of the demographic issues here in Mississippi, is that we can't leave voter suppression out of the story, right? Voter suppression since the 2020 election, states have adopted voter suppression bills in a pattern that we haven't seen for generations, really. The attack on voting rights in this country since the 2020 election has been dramatic, and that includes Mississippi. We've seen bills introduced and enacted here in Mississippi that limit the ability of people to vote absentee. We've seen bills that have made it easier to purge people from the voter rolls. We've seen bills that are based on mis and disinformation about non-citizens voting, which we know is not an issue here in Mississippi, that makes it much easier for people to show up to the polling place on election day. Their names aren't on the rolls, even though they've been voting there for 30 years. And so these types of things have an impact on not only the burdens that people face to vote, but also the willingness that someone might have to go to the polls when they know that their state is enacting these types of procedures and laws intended to make it more difficult. People, I think, will be more disillusioned about actually voting. And here in Mississippi, we know that voter suppression bills have a disproportionate impact on Black voters and on voters with disabilities. And so I think that's an essential part of the story that we have to remember when we're thinking about turnout. You know, it's impossible, I won't say impossible, it's very difficult to say that, you know, a particular voter or a group of voters turned out because of or not because of a particular thing. It's very hard for us to say that, you know, this particular bill actually was the result of these voters not voting, but we know that, you know, there's academic analysis and research that shows that certain types of laws increase the cost of voting. Increase the cost of voting for a particular voter because you have to get an extra signature or get someone to notarize your absentee ballot application or you know, have a witness fill out 3 extra forms to be able to get assistance from them to be able to vote. And so we know that the cost of voting in Mississippi is among the highest in the entire country. And so that has an impact on turnout. And that's part of why Mississippi is consistently ranked in the lowest tiers of states for turnout, including in the election that we just saw.
You know, it was interesting when I went to my poll in South Jackson, and for the first time, I go there, and there was, and I thought this was impactful, there was 2 people who had to sign affidavit to do their vote. And I was only there less than, you know, it didn't take me but, you know, less than 5 minutes to get my vote in. But while I was there, just for those few minutes, 2 people had to sign affidavits to do, because their name, they could not find their name in the computerized system or on the poll.
There was one precinct, the precinct at JSU, at Jackson State, there were 300 students who had to vote affidavit.
Wow.
At one single precinct. There's something going on. There's an issue there that, and I don't know for sure, but when I was, you know, I was talking to the election commissioners, the Hinds County election commissioners, about what's going on, and they told me that the majority of those ballots were not going to count.
Wow.
Because they have to be rejected. And so that's, you know, and that's a little bit different from what I was talking about, in that those are kind of administrative issues, right? That's not the legislature passing a certain bill that makes it harder to vote. Those are administrative errors or you know, things that have gone wrong in the election administration process, and that's very common in Mississippi, very common across counties here.
What were the dominant issues and priorities in Mississippi that shaped the presidential election results? You know, what I kept hearing over and over again in the media is that people were, even though there were some positive things happening in the economy, people were not feeling it on the ground. They were not feeling it in their pocketbooks and their jobs and their opportunities. So what are the issues that impacted both the presidential and state elections?
Well, we can, we can go off of exit polling data. And exit polling data, I think in all 50 states, suggested that the modal voter, the most common response to the most important issue question, was the economy. It almost always is. What surprised many people, and surprised me too, was that according to exit polling data, abortion was the most important issue for only about 14% of voters nationwide. And my understanding had been that the Democratic Party had really been hoping for discontent over the Dobbs decision and state rollbacks of reproductive rights to really be a catalyst, because abortion was one of the only issues on the agenda that in polling, voters consistently told pollsters that they trusted Harris more on than Trump. Most every other issue, he was cleaning her clock. So the moment that I saw the exit polls come back, and abortion is the most important issue for only 14%, I figured, well, we're looking at not a Trump blowout, but this is not going to go Kamala Harris's way. So the economy had something to do with it. And I've been talking with my class about exactly what the economy means to voters. It means many, many, many different things. And I don't know that and this is not a criticism of any particular campaign's strategy, except for the COVID recession, which was sort of a quasi-planned economic shutdown. The United States hasn't had a recession since 2008, 2009. So the economic indicators that people use to evaluate the economy are blowing up in all kinds of weird ways. So a lot of research needs to be done, and political scientists are doing it right now on just what voters mean when they say that the economy is the most important issue. Certainly they don't want to be yelled at that the economy is doing just fine, thank you very much, and your concerns are invalid. The economy, this was an election that was largely about negative evaluations of the economy, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because what we've heard so much from first the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign on the economy were all of the successes that the Biden administration had on the economic front, and just objectively looking at the types of policies that were enacted over the past 4 years, there were a tremendous number of successes, and so it's interesting. I think one of the criticisms that I heard a lot about the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign were that they were not effectively communicating their successes. But the point that Dr. Schmidt just made about how, when voters are really feeling it in their pocketbooks, they're feeling the pain in their pocketbooks, and then they're being told consistently, well, look at all that we've done for you. Look at all of the legislation that was enacted. Look at all of the, executive actions that have been taken that help the economy. The economy's doing better than ever. But when voters are actually looking at their budget and, not able to put food on the table for the last 5 days of the month, or whatever the case might be, they're not going to be receptive to hearing, well, the economy is just booming. And so that's a really interesting point that I think might, I'd be interested in learning more about how that actually might have impacted voter turnout this cycle.
Well, and just one way that I think about it is, just imagine that your landlord raised your rent exorbitantly when inflation was at its worst. Have you ever heard of a landlord reducing somebody's rent because inflation is better? Right? Like, it just flat doesn't happen. People are living with those, inflation rent hikes today, and that had to have had something to do with it.
Yeah, I have just a comment on that. So you're earlier talking about young people and voting.
Yeah.
Tying the economy to young people and voting. I heard on NPR, public radio has tried to, do the both sides. This is what GOP, this is what Democrats are thinking. So early on, before the election, they interviewed, the idea is this, that young men were voting clearly differently from young women. That was being discussed, right? And in particular, young men with a high school education were voting very differently from young women and more young women are going to college. That's just a fact. But then when you think about what does the economy mean to these two groups, the young men were saying, my expectation is I should be the head of the household. I should be able to support this family. She should not go to work. Whereas the young women, again, they're probably going to college, were thinking, the economy to me is my future, my opportunity for independence and autonomy. I'm not thinking about this guy that's gonna support me for life. So the economy, again, just to build on what you all are saying, meant completely different things to these two young people. And so I guess my point is simply, it's just not as simple as everybody's saying, the economy, I'm not putting food on my table, my parents can't do whatever. For at least for young people, the economy was totally a different thing. And their cultural things.
And depending on who you are, it's tapping different value structures,
exactly.
right?
That's what I'm saying.
What it means to live a good life. I think that's a brilliant point.
We're gonna switch to our audience a little bit. I think our audience wants to get involved at this point.
Yeah.
And we have a few more questions we're gonna come back to. But I wanna open up the floor right now for what we've covered so far. And I see a hand already here.
I have a request, and this is Mayor. Your sort of your first statement about Georgia and Louisiana and why some people don't feel like they have a choice, etc. I wish you would put that in writing, because in our GOTV work, that's something that we need to have at the top of our brains. And the way you stated it was so powerful. And I don't know if, are you recording this?
Yes, we're on Facebook.
Okay, so maybe you can clip that part and send it to me, and I'll transcribe it if you want to. Or, anyway, I would love to have that statement to help in the GOTV work.
Sure, and I'll do you one better. LDF is actually working on some research to actually kind of quantify the turnout impact in both of those states, in both of those districts, and to really tie this idea of effective representation to turnout. And so what still in the works, but once it's ready, we'll definitely share broadly. And I think it makes total sense. And I think it's really, really important in Mississippi, not only for our federal elections, but even more important for our state elections. You know, in our state legislative elections last year, there were about 75% of the legislative seats were uncontested. Mm-hmm. And what that tells me is that, one, the incumbents don't feel the need to really campaign in those districts. They don't have challengers. There's no threat to them, right? And two, those districts are drawn in a way where people aren't incentivized to actually run against the incumbent, right? And so I think it's really important from the perspective of our state legislature for there to be fairly drawn districts that really give people a meaningful way to participate in the political process.
Any additional questions?
I have one, getting back to young people and partisanship. Mm-hmm. This idea of voting party line. Mm-hmm. Are there statistics on that age group that you cited, their affiliation with the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party versus independent?
Yes, but I don't have them off the top of my head. I'm remembering polling on candidate preference, which is actually these days a really good proxy for your partisanship. Mm-hmm. So if it was the case, and again I have no reason to doubt it, that had 100% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted, that Kamala Harris would have received about 17 percentage points more of the youth vote than Trump, then the partisan gap among voters 18 to 29 is about 17 percentage points in favor of the Democratic Party. Now that may be that might be an overestimate, but not by much. Young voters, especially college-educated young voters, but young voters, period, tend to lean Democrat. It's just a matter of turnout. I mean, this was a serious turnout failure from the perspective of the Democratic Party, from everything that I've read and from sort of the election autopsies that I've been poring over.
Mm. This is probably good. Do we have another question?
I'm sorry about that, Willie. What is the comparison of the young voter in the prior election? What's the percentage difference in the prior election compared to this election?
Well, I know that 50% turned out to vote. I don't have off the top of my head. Amir, do you recall 18 to 29-year-olds exactly what the breakdown was for Biden and Trump? I know that Biden won among young voters.
Well,
I believe he won by much more than Harris won.
Which is interesting. You know, my son, and I hate to say this, and I'm going to leave Women Voters member, my youngest son refused to vote. And he full blast for Biden. He went out and voted, but him and his friends would not vote because they were upset about the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you cannot not vote because of that. He's like, I'm not voting for Trump, and I don't support what we're doing in the Middle East. And I was like, son, you still have to vote. But he was very upset about that. And they were all on TikTok, and they were all talking about it, and that media aspect, and they were all talking about what was going over there, how many people were being killed on both sides, and how we weren't, they were so involved in that. And I think the Democrats, I don't know, but it seems like they didn't go out there enough to explain the situation or those things, because all these young people, that was all that they were talking about, especially if they're at college.
It's a segue to social media. I have a question. I think we all tend to think that the time we're in is extraordinarily unprecedented. And I'm sure it is. But from your perspective, you're learned subject matter experts in the arc of our time. Are there other, and considering social media, which is probably one of the most dynamic existential experiences we have, unlike any other time, are there other times in our history that we can point to look at this moment of division, of massive change in demographic fractures or any of that, that we can look to and say, we've been here before?
I have a very kind of depressing answer to that question, so why don't you go first? So
I tend to be the one with the depressing answer. So this is the most competitive two-party system that the United States has ever had. And it's also probably the most polarized. And when I say that, I don't mean that the divisions today are as profound and pronounced as the divisions that propelled the country into a civil war. But what I just mean is that the percentage of Democrats in Congress that consistently vote against Republicans in Congress and vice versa is sky high. The polarization in Congress, the rate at which the parties vote against each other in party line votes, is higher than it's been at any point since the end of Reconstruction. Again, not suggesting that today is somehow as bad as the end of Reconstruction, but it's partisan polarization, the sharp divisions between the two parties at the national level, that's pretty unique to the present era. If you add in that national elections today for the presidency are very, very close, are decided on the basis of a few 100,000 votes or less in a few swing states. The analogy that lots of people like to draw is to 1896 or thereabouts, another period of pretty pronounced income inequality. So we think of that period round about the Industrial Revolution as the Gilded Age. Some political scientists have called today a second Gilded Age. I'm not endorsing that perspective necessarily, but that was also a period of time where there were populist rumblings in public opinion, and populist ideology was making its way into the way that candidates for the presidency talked about their positions, and also concerns about populism were making their way into efforts to shut down minor party challenges, for sure. So if I wanted to draw a historical parallel, I would probably look late 1800s, early 1900s, just in terms of pronounced income inequality and pronounced partisan divisions.
Yeah, so, I, by virtue of my work and kind of my lens in viewing kind of what's going on in our country today is through the lens of racial justice, right? And so and what we've seen in the history of race relations is in this country, in the history of the rights of minority individuals in this country, is that it's a pendulum, right? There's progress, and then the pendulum swings back, there's backlash, and then there's more progress, and then there's more backlash. And I think right now where we're at in terms of the swinging of the pendulum is in a state of backlash, because what we've seen since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which really gave effect to the right to vote for Black people and other minorities in this country, we've seen tremendous progress in the ability of Black voters and other minority voters to elect representatives to our institutions. And we saw just voter registration numbers skyrocket since 1965. We've seen minorities in elected positions skyrocket since 1965, and there's been tremendous progress since then. Obviously, we have not fixed race in this country, right? But there was a significant amount of kind of representative progress over that time, and I think what we are experiencing now is a backlash to that progress. And I think it's most pronounced it's been most pronounced over the past 4 years, where we saw in 2020 really dramatic and historic turnout among minority voters. Minority voters participated in that election at a rate that they had not participated ever in this country. And in the immediate aftermath, literally a month and a half after the November election, we saw a coup driven by white supremacist ideology. We also saw states around the country, that's what I alluded to before, introduce and enact a barrage of voter suppression bills, many of which were specifically targeted at methods of voting that we know were disproportionately used by minority voters in 2020. And very, very kind of surgically targeting those. Like, for example, in Harris County, Texas, that's where Houston is, incredibly diverse county. That county adopted what was called drive-through voting in 2020 because of the pandemic. It was a safer way for people to vote. 130,000 people or so used that method of voting, mostly Black people and Latino people. The Texas legislature, in an omnibus bill called SB1, specifically banned drive-through voting, even though Harris County was the only county that used it, and there was no indication that it made it easier to commit voter fraud, or that there were any errors or issues, discrepancies that it created. And so that's an example of the types of ways that state legislatures really surgically targeted how minority voters voted. And we've seen the same thing happen over the past, the 22 session, the 23 session, 24 sessions. And so I think, Dr. Schmidt alluded to the end of Reconstruction and that time period in the late 1800s. I agree that we're in a similar moment where, after the Civil War, you saw, especially in Mississippi, you saw the state legislature was majority Black. Elected officials, majority of elected officials were Black in Mississippi in the period immediately after the Civil War. Black voter registration took off. And then you saw things like the 1890 Constitution, the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, the implementation of Jim Crow through poll taxes and literacy tests. And so I think, I don't want to, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic in saying that we're kind of in a that same type of era right now, but I think we're experiencing the same dynamics where we are the country demographically is going to be majority minority by 2050 by some calculations, by the other calculations even earlier than that. Mississippi will likely be majority minority even earlier than 2050. And so I think that there's a recognition that the power structures are changing, and what we're seeing is an attempt to cling to the previous power structures.
And when we talk about history, and history matters to what this work that we're even talking about today, we don't talk enough about the race issue. I mean, there's been a huge attack on diversity and inclusion. That used to be part of America, to everybody to be included and want to hear everybody's voice and those type of things. Now it's become this bad word that nobody wants to talk about. I mean, there's conferences that are having to redefine the titles of their conferences and take out inclusion. When you look at the definition of inclusion, what's bad about that? You know what I'm saying? So, yes, definitely history. We have to talk about that more. We have to bring race into it because it definitely matters. There was a recent expert historian on a local station that said that candidates and politicians have become servant of the parties versus servant of the people. And I think he hit it right on the nail, because when you think about being a servant of the people, you're thinking about what people need, what they're, that inclusion piece in those things. Can you speak to that a little bit before we move on?
Oh, before we get, I wanted to go back to the point that Amir brought up and just get both of our guess, notion of where we are in the pendulum swing. And I just want to also mention, I'm currently reading Greg Iles' Southern Man. Be careful if you don't have a strong stomach. Pendulum, where are we?
Oh, I think we're kind of in that period of backlash.
Ascendancy of that.
Right. Yeah. We were in a period of advancement after 1965, and I think 2020 was kind of I don't want to say the culmination, but it was a significant representation of how far we've come because of that really dramatic minority turnout, and now I think we're in a period of backlash to that progress.
Wow.
Yeah, you could make a very good case, and I think that Amir's made it, that with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the United States is essentially reborn. We have near full adult suffrage for the first time in U.S. history. You can think of the short period of Reconstruction as the exception to that rule, but women didn't have the right to vote at that time. So yes, you have near full adult suffrage from 1965 to the present, and there is a historical paradigm that treats the United States as a very young democracy in that sense. We can think of the United States as really having risen to its full height as a democracy only in 1965, and that means that we may still be grappling with exactly what it means to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. We're still learning that. We're still learning how to do that. One thing I'd be really interested in getting the audiences and Amir's take on too is this narrative that's emerged post-election that the partisan preferences of racial and ethnic minority groups, blacks and Latinos specifically, are somehow changing in some major ways, and whether that complicates the conversation. Because I'm trying to figure that out myself.
I'm glad you said that, Dr. Schmidt, because that's what I kept thinking, Amir, as you were chatting about the backlash, that there are so many complex things happening because the Republican Party, as an example, is celebrating the increase in a more diverse group of population adopting these conservative policies that help take that party over the goal line, including men of many ethnicities and backgrounds, not just traditional white. So that they're celebrating that. So I'm interested in that. And then from a backlash standpoint, segueing and dovetailing on what Sharon said, something that's sort of interesting to me is this backlash against female power, female rise in economic prowess and economic independence. And some of these population groups, whether they are whatever demographic they are, this backlash against the fact that women are in more positions of power ever, and you have to wonder whether some of these, and I don't want to be careful, I want to be fair about male populations of less education of all ethnicities feeling that pressure. A, they can't support the family, and B, the women are graduating at higher rates. These women are in positions of power. These women are bankers, and they're managers, and they're my boss, and they're bitchy and loud and whatever they are, and how many divorces going on, and how many exes are out there, and some visceral reaction to the woman in charge. So, speak to the backlash against the female incursion in society.
Yeah, sorry, do you want to say something before I start?
Finish your thought, please.
Well, I think these are really tough questions to answer, and I don't have the data at my disposal. I know that I saw the preliminary numbers about kind of the numbers of the kind of the demographic breakdown of who voted for Trump and who voted for Harris, and what that showed was, black women, as we expected, were the most staunch supporters of the vice president. Black men slightly trailed, and there was, and more black men voted for Trump this time than than voted for him in 2020. And so there was some drop off among black men, I believe, and then there was more significant drop off among Latinos, including and more significant among Latino men than among Latino women, meaning more significant drop off for the Democrats as opposed to the Republicans. And so I think that the dynamics that you mentioned, Debbie, are absolutely at play, and you saw that you heard that in the rhetoric of the campaign, the Trump campaign, very similar to the rhetoric that he had against Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I think you also saw that in the way that the demographics broke down between men and women of every race, right? Like women, I think across all races, voted more strongly for Harris than they did for Trump. And so I think that there's absolutely this kind of backlash at play against women as well. And you know, in terms of explaining the race question and why, you know, minority voters voted in greater numbers for Trump this cycle than in previous cycles, you know, I think one thing that we have to remember is that it is not uncommon for people to vote against their own interests. And I think that there are all sorts of kind of they're really complicated race questions about, you know, why a Latino person would cite immigration as the most significant reason to vote for Donald Trump, right? Because that was not an uncommon reason for Latinos to vote for Trump. And one of the narratives that came out was that, you know, there are certain immigrants came here following the law, and they didn't want to allow immigrants who did not follow the law to come into the country. That was one narrative that kind of played out, right? I think for black voters as well, there were more black voters who voted for Donald Trump this cycle than previous cycles, and I can't profess to know exactly why that was the case, but I think that we can't forget that racism exists within racial communities, you know, and racism also exists among racial communities. And so there, I think, is, you know, among non-blacks in the country, I think there's oftentimes a desire to approach whiteness, right? Like to be more proximate to whiteness, because that is the idea of success in this country. And so I think that's a dynamic that was likely at play.
We've got to get a couple of questions in on, I'm going to let the audience answer a couple more questions, but we definitely want to wrap up our conversation with the path forward.
Yes.
We got to get that in, a couple of questions on that. And also, we're live on a couple of pages, and I see several people that have chimed in.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for joining us. This is the League of Women Voters monthly meeting. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Mr. Eric Smith, from professor at Millsaps, and also Amir Badat, who's with the Legal Defense Fund, who's giving us some great information. We're talking about election autopsy. So thank you all so much for joining us. If you have some comments, please put your comments. We'll be glad to share that. And if you have questions, I'm sure we have someone within League of Women Voters after our session will follow up to answer any questions that you might have. But it looked like we had two more hands that are in our audience.
Thank you for answering or speaking mostly to what I was going to say. But on last night's PBS NewsHour, there was a segment on Hispanic voting in the last election. And the point was brought out by a Hispanic man that it wasn't about some of the issues that the Democrats put forth. It was about economics. And we know Cubans have always been on the Republican side of the aisle because of the business interests. Well, more Hispanics are interested in business. I think on the Black issue, a lot of it had to do with the genocide in Gaza. We have identified with the Palestinians from the beginning, 76 years. And people have gotten to the point, I believe, where they say, I'm not going to vote against my best interests. I'm gonna vote for my interests. And Gaza was a big point in some people's not voting.
Do we have another? So, me, right?
Yes.
So, before we stop talking about the historical perspective, I'm wondering if either of you would comment on the Supreme Court and like post-Reconstruction and what went on then, and then what's going on now.
Yeah, I think that the court, it's tempting for me to say that the court has never been totally apolitical. There are some decisions that were made in the run-up to the presidential election, most notably Trump v. United States, and the decision that presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution for their official actions that sure look partisan to me. But I say sure look because it's always difficult for me to know where we are in history. And I think that there's an even odds chance, I truly mean this, I think that there's an even odds chance that the Trump v. United States decision is seen in 30 years as one of the things that helped depolarize the country by ending sort of the litigiousness with which we think about the actions of presidents with whom we disagree. It's also entirely possible that it empowers presidents to do things that I don't think anybody in this room, Republican or Democrat, would assent to. So I'm going to punt on the question because I don't know where we are in history. I truly don't.
What about just a little bit of history post-Reconstruction? So look, the Supreme Court certainly played a role, right, as we moved into.
Well, certainly the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, codifying separate but equal as totally consistent with the 14th Amendment. That's a grave sin on the part of the Supreme Court. I don't know whether I would, and I would be interested to ask the legal expert in the room. I'm not sure if I would draw any parallels between the court's decision now to Plessy, but I'm going to shut up now.
Yeah, I think that we're in a tough time in our country as it comes to the Supreme Court, because we've seen examples of the Supreme Court make very political decisions and make decisions that are, I would describe them loosely based on the law. For example, in 2013, the Supreme Court decided a case called Shelby versus Holder, which was it was a challenge to the Voting Rights Act, to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required that certain states in the country that had a long history of discrimination, Mississippi included, would have to pre-clear their election laws, their new election laws and procedures with the Department of Justice. And so if Mississippi wanted to pass a voter ID law, they would have to make a submission to the Department of Justice first to show that the voter ID law did not have a discriminatory impact on Black voters in Mississippi. And that was an incredible protection against discrimination over the span of the decades that the Voting Rights Act, or that Section 5 was in effect, because it was an ex ante check, meaning voter suppression laws didn't have a chance to actually disenfranchise people before they were challenged. Once Section 5 was gutted under the Shelby versus County decision, the Shelby County versus Holder decision, then that's one of the things that led to this barrage of voter suppression laws that I mentioned before. But the court's reasoning, I think, is really important to remember in gutting Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, because what the Chief Justice Roberts wrote was that we are in a period of time now where we no longer need the protection of Section 5, because Section 5 has had a positive impact, and these states no longer need to have that ex ante check against them to prohibit them from passing discriminatory voting laws. And so I think that's a really telling example of where the court's mind is. The court is not a monolith, obviously. There are 9 different justices, but they have to come to some type of consensus, or at least a majority have to come to some type of consensus about a particular decision. And there, you saw the Chief Justice, who was now actually considered one of the more moderate members of the court, write that essentially we're in a post-racial society, which we all know that that's not true, right? And we've seen a host of decisions over the past 5 to 10 years that I think are similarly disjointed from our reality and disjointed, more importantly, from the law. And so, you know, we saw Dobbs obviously doing away with Roe v. Wade. We've seen the court more and more willing to throw away long-standing precedent and do away with the doctrine of stare decisis, and more and more willing to create new law and not abide by legal doctrines that have prevented these types of dramatic swings in the law for many, many years. And so I think we are in a place where, you know, I'll say personally as a civil rights litigator, I think about really hard before I bring a case, do I want this case to go before this court? Even if I think that we are right on the law and that we have a strong case, I have to think about what happens if this gets before this court. And that, I think, you know, we always have to think about that, but the calculation is much different with this court.
And I want to move to us wrapping up and talk a little bit about the pathway forward and what we can expect here in Mississippi. And when you talked about, Amir, about you get thinking twice now about what cases you bring forward. Of course, I think what I've heard overwhelmingly from local voters is this fear of what this election is going to do to policy making in the state of Mississippi. And so can both of you all talk about how this election is going to impact policy next year, and how organizations like League of Women Voters and so many others who worked so hard this year, how can they address that issue? How can they be a part of that voice? How to make sure that the public is being educated? Speak to that around policy in Mississippi.
So, having recently moved to Mississippi, I don't yet have the expertise on Mississippi state politics to give a really, really terrific answer to the question, but I will say this. Mississippi's had a Republican supermajority for some time. So the consequences, I mean, we can debate whether the consequences are good or bad, but the consequences of unified Republican control of the government have been felt in Mississippi for quite a while. So to that extent, policy making in Mississippi, I don't actually see changing that much.
Mm-hmm.
But I could be corrected on that.
Medicaid.
I'll let you finish. Right.
Yeah. So we're talking, yes, the point was raised about the Medicaid expansion. But the governor, my understanding was that Governor Reeves would have been reluctant to go along with the Medicaid expansion no matter who won the presidential election.
I'm not an expert on that bill, but I would defer to you, Amir, where Medicaid could be expanded in Mississippi with the work requirement, which they believed would be approved by the next administration. So we could expand Medicaid in Mississippi, but have that work requirement, which was denied by the previous administration, which would be accepted here. That's a major change in healthcare expansion for Mississippi.
No doubt.
Okay.
But there's also the likelihood that people will be taken off the rolls because of the
Exactly.
So there's this, and I don't know all the numbers, but I remember years ago when our Indivisible group dug into this, it was an issue that work requirement was more about taking people off the rolls. We can pretend we have an expansion, but the idea was we're going to save so much money because we will have fewer people on the rolls. That was some years ago when we looked into it, I'm like, so I see that just coming back, okay, great. And it sounds good, but I'll believe it when I see it laid out in front of me.
Amir, will you?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think the way that Dr. Schmidt just described kind of the possibilities here in Mississippi is really apt. And I've said this a couple of times where, Mississippi has been living under Project 2025 conditions for a long time, right? And so, I agree that I don't know that we're gonna see really dramatic shifts in policy. I think we will see a potential emboldening of certain views, attacks against DEI. I think we're already seeing that play out. University of Mississippi has been going through a fight for a while now on DEI issues. And so I think there are certain things like that where we will start seeing more direct and aggressive attacks on things like DEI and maybe other areas of education. But I still think that there are huge opportunities in Mississippi. I think that because Mississippi has been living under Project 2025 conditions for so long, there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from the advocates and activists that have been doing work here for a long time. I think that last legislative session, we saw real progress on things like Medicaid expansion, early voting, rights restoration, where one chamber of the legislature actually passed all 3 of those bills. And I think there's that momentum that we're carrying into this legislative session. And I think there's a real chance that we can get those things passed. I do have concerns about Medicaid expansion because of the work requirement and because there are, conversations going on in Washington about potentially eliminating at least a portion of the federal match for Medicaid expansion. So I think that could throw a wrench into things, but I still think that there's momentum to potentially get it done. And so I am actually, I'm feeling very motivated, and I don't want to say optimistic, but I'm feeling really motivated about prospects for change in Mississippi over the next few years through the life of this next administration, because I think we have the tools, we have the people, we have the ideas that can actually achieve change here.
Okay. Do we have one other response regarding the opportunities for organizations like ours moving forward? Does anyone like to speak to that? Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up here. We've been a little bit over our time, but that's good. We got some good information in. You all have been amazing. I would like to give you all each 60 seconds to give us any wrap up on our conversations today as a walkaway.
Yeah, the only thing that I would like to say is one of the reasons that I have such great respect for the League of Women Voters, besides that you're the League of Women Voters, is that you're a nonpartisan organization. I think it's very, very important that you're a nonpartisan organization, especially important right now. I understand that post-election feelings are running high, that this is an outcome that we saw at the presidential level and also at statewide levels too, that many people who are members of the League of Women Voters may find deeply disappointing, but this is a time when we all need to be listening to each other. And there are a lot of people who have lots of diverse and interesting and possibly eccentric and possibly misplaced reasons, who knows, for having voted the way that they did in the election or for staying home. And if we don't listen to each other, then all of our worst fears about the next 4, 8, 12 years are going to be realized. One of my jobs as an educator, and I really don't have a political identity in the classroom, I try very hard not to, is to listen to my students and listen to why they come at particular issues the way that they do. And so listening is terribly, terribly important right now. If you know somebody who disagrees with you on everything, you don't have to agree with them. You don't have to even not be offended by them, but you should listen to them, or at least try to. Okay? That's just my 2 cents. All right.
That was a great way of wrapping up. I'm not sure if I can follow that well, but I think, obviously I have a tremendous amount of love and respect for the work that the League does, and I think it's going to continue being incredibly important over the next, even just over the next year. Elaine mentioned we have a state Supreme Court race that's going to run off that could determine a lot about what the state Supreme Court looks like. We have municipal elections in less than a year in Mississippi, and we know that municipal elections, local and county offices, they make the decisions that really impact our day-to-day lives. And so I think that the work of the league in registering voters, in educating voters, mobilizing people to go to the polls is going to be so tremendously important over the next year, regardless of what happens in Washington. And so I would just urge everyone here, keep hitting the ground, keep knocking on doors, keep talking to community members, and doing the work that you're already doing to make sure that people are participating in the political process, because we can't not do that work.
Wonderful. Let's give our speakers a round. And before our listeners, we're on a couple of pages today. Thank you all so much for joining.